Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we have a very special bike. This is the first ever 1997 Giant TCR. We brought this bike to ride on the channel and today we're going to service it and transform it ready for that ride, and it's been sat still for many years. This had a few problems. It wasn't shifting gear, so it wasn't actually usable. You can see a little bit of damage there on the handlebars. You can see here both shifters were like this. They weren't actually operating at all. They were free and loose, so there was a bit of a risk with buying this bike in that potentially we may have an unrideable bike. The brakes were pulling the wheels over to one side. This can put a bit of strain and flex into the wheel. The headset bearings were very tight on this one, so it had issues and we needed to sort those out with a service. You can see here the chain is okay. I can tell from the entire condition of the bike that this bike is virtually unused but has stood for many years in this condition, gradually deteriorating as it stands. But for me, this service was all about originality and swapping out as fewer parts as possible to keep the bike as original as possible, because it is a very historic and important bike. So first thing for me to do is to get the components off of the bike that I'm going to clean and service. No problems removing that rear cassette. These wheels were super unique with carbon fibre spokes. They're a really cool concept. The cassette is relatively clean. There's a little bit of oil on it, which really does suggest to me that this bike has not been used an awful lot, but we're going to deal with all that. But one thing we did find here was the loose derailleur hanger. Now this normally happens over mileage, but I can tell this bike hasn't done the miles, so that would have actually have ended up, if this bike ever had done the miles, that would have probably been its first failure point during its life, with that derailleur hanger coming loose and having problems with the back end of this bike. So I'm going to actually take that derailleur hanger off of the bike. I'll clean that up. I'll put that through the ultrasonic cleaner, and then you can see here the derailleur, there's a little bit of build up of greases on there, but we also need to lubricate this because, like the front shifters, it can be problems if it's not lubricated correctly. So I will clean that up and lubricate that on the bench. Same with this front derailleur, there's a little bit of spotty rust on there, very dry, clearly needs lubricating and cleaning up. So as part of this service I'm going to do that as well. Now I also wanted to take the chain set off. I wanted to check the bearings throughout the bike to see how they were, but I didn't really want to do the bearings if it was unnecessary, again for the historic value of the bike. So first of all I'm going to take this chain set off. So first of all we take the right hand side off, we extract that off. You can see there's a build up again, very similar to the rear derailleur, not too bad, but it's there. We just need to clean that up. Off comes the left hand pedal arm. Now this is quite an unusual group set, and it was the first group set really that Shimano produced where they'd gone from chrome and alloy components to anodized finishes and finishing components, but these components were actually painted. So they have this lovely gloss grey finish to them. Very nice, very unique to this group set and this era. This is the 105 SC group setting. This actual particular one on this is the 8-speed version of that. Period correct for the bike, so I've no doubt this is original on the bike. This is the 105/6 8-speed. So we're going to remove the front caliper and take out the cables. Now what I'm going to actually do with this bike as I do it is I'm going to try and keep all the original outers on the bike. I don't want to disturb those. I'm just going to replace the cables themselves. You can see here front brake also needs a clean up. Now the handlebar tape was a tricky problem in a sense. It's Sinelli handlebar tape. It's got their logo running around the tape itself. The end caps are a shiny chrome finish, and it had that finishing tape in the center with a Sinelli logo on it. Now I was able to get a replacement tape, but the end caps and the tape on the end was a different patterning, so I also then had to buy those individually and separately. So I had to get the handlebar tape to keep it the same as original from 3 different sources. So even that in itself was a little bit tricky, took a little bit of figuring out. I am also going to only take the shifters off of these handlebars because you can see there's a cushioning stuck down the inside edge of the handlebars. That I couldn't find anywhere. I didn't want to disturb that. I wanted these to go in the same place, so you can see there I took those off separately. The headset you can see is very stiff. It's not flowing freely. It's quite stiff. That would make the bike a little bit trammy when you were riding. It would veer off. You'd have to be constantly putting input in to keep that straight. So I need to deal with these headset bearings. Now these headset bearings absolutely amazing. They are the correct ones for the bike, but very, very uniquely to this bike, they were roller bearings, not ball bearings, so I need to clean those up. This bike was a bit of a concept bike of the day, really. It was the first compact road bike frame ever produced, designed by the late great Mike Burrows after he produced or had input into the Lotus 108 bike. So this was one of his first concepts for Giant, this compact road frame. So there were a lot of innovations on this bike, one of being the headset bearings, having them roller bearings. I'm sure that was part of his process for producing a high quality bike. I've cleaned up the cup on the forks. Now I'm going to do the same with the one on the frame. I'm going to degrease all the old grease off of the bearing as well. These were fairly fragile. It doesn't really show on the camera, but I was being super careful to not push too hard. So you can see there I've cleaned up the roller bearings. The ones on the left are still very grimy, had that thickening of grease, and that was why the headset bearings weren't flowing freely. It wasn't through use, it was just through thickening of grease over time. So you can see on goes that bottom race there. Very, very unique. I've never actually seen a roller bearing headset bearing. I know they exist, but in terms of my day-to-day servicing, this was a first for me, and it was a pleasure to get these back together and actually then to see them operating correctly once we'd finished the bike. So we're using our premium grease there to lubricate those. That will stand the test of time and will always remain very, very nice. And then this cap I'm also washing down. But the unique thing about this cap was that in the center it actually has a O-ring in the center there, and I'm using our silicone grease here, which is very good for rubber O-rings like this in wheels and things like this, because the quill that goes through the center of that runs on that, and it will keep that supple and also help the quill slide into the forks without damaging that O-ring in any way. Again, this bike is very much about preservation, so we adjust that up and that's now ready for the handlebars to go on. Next up, I'm going to deal with this lovely rear derailleur. Again, it has that painted finish rather than anodizing or aluminium, but it does have that cover there, the aluminium, that we will clean up. And same with this chain set, we've got the aluminium rings on the painted center and then these stainless steel bolts holding it all together. The three colors really look nice. You'll see that in the after shots, how this complements itself. I'm paying lots of attention to cleaning this one up, as it's just as likely to end up on display as on the road. Taking the rings apart allows me to get the chain sets back to spotless, and also these chain rings can corrode together, so there's no harm in greasing and future-proofing that. We're popping the few aluminium parts that we have got into the ultrasonic cleaner, the few parts that can be cleaned up, and now with the derailleurs themselves, I'm only going to wash these down because I didn't want to disturb that paint in any way, shape or form. We wanted to keep that original. We didn't want to affect the finish on it or alter it in any way, so we washed those down and then dried those off before we put them back on the bike. Same with these shifters. These were a little bit of a problem. At this point we still didn't know if we would get those working. The original spoke protector here is in amazing condition, which is another great thing for this bike. You can see here that lovely cassette, 8-speed, very little wear, very, very nicely finished, lovely chroming finish on there. And now the chain. I didn't change with one of our lovely silver chains that we sell. I used the original chain because again this is a preservation restoration, so it still means that we service it the same way. You can see here we're using our premium grease on the jockey wheels to lubricate those before we put those back into the rear derailleur. They then spin very, very freely and have got plenty of life. We're still using our thread locker to make sure that the pivots for those don't come undone in the future when it's being ridden. You can see there's a little bit of engraving on that arm. That's very unique to the 1056 8-speed. The 7-speed version of this didn't have that engraving on that arm, and that's now all back together nicely. I will also lubricate the thumb adjusters. These I wanted to make sure were absolutely spot on because all these components had grey plastic rather than the more traditional modern black plastic fittings. So this adjuster here had this lovely grey finish to it. Same with the adjusters on the brakes, and you can see the plastic around that pivot point there that my finger is actually on at the moment. That's also a grey plastic. So very, very unique to this group set, very, very unique to this era of bike, and very, very important to keep those where at all possible and not to change them from the original design of this bike. Using our general purpose oil there on the pivot points of the front derailleur to to make sure that that's nicely lubricated and will operate and actuate nicely. Fresh pads onto the brakes. I always change the pads out because they are rubber. They do go hard with age. So although we're trying to preserve the bike, we're also trying to make it safe for riding and make sure that it can be ridden if the owner wants to ride these sort of bikes. So now in goes the brakes thumb adjuster. The brake has a few pivot points as well, and I've seen many brakes seize up where the pivots have corroded, so that's quite important. And then again, a little bit of our silicone grease, because this little metal arm slides through a plastic fit in there, and that's a great way of lubricating plastics on metals. And of course we also lubricate the skewer, so we've got our general purpose oil on the arm, that's actuating nicely. Then a little bit of our general purpose grease along the shaft of that. This was never lubricated from the factory or from when the bike arrived at us. That was very, very dry, so that will all help with any corrosion possibilities in the future and making sure that that doesn't happen. Now we're on to this shifter. Now we're using our general purpose oil here to help break down any greases that were inside there. This sort of component you never want to be taking apart, because if anything breaks you're never going to get it. So we lubricated that over 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 goes, and you can hear there it actuated absolutely perfectly. This is the front derailleur shifter, working beautifully after a couple of goes with the oil. And then the rear derailleur, we actually had to do the rear derailleur over probably 4 or 5 different oilings over 2 or 3 days, keep actuating it, and suddenly it starts going and away it goes again, and we were able to save both of the shifters without replacing them, so we were very pleased there. Next up I'm going to put this front chain ring together, so I'm using a little bit of general purpose grease there on the spider of the arms. That will help this come apart again in the future and stop any corrosion between the components. And on go the chainring bolts there. You can see the 3 colours there, the lovely painted centre, the aluminium rings, and then the stainless steel bolts holding it together. And then finally I'm going to torque that up in a star pattern. It's important these bolts aren't over tightened, as they're very common to snap. Now I'm going to wash the frame down, so we're using a foam spray there to initially wet the bike down to help any debris that is on the bike come off. The paint on this bike actually was very, very good. When we were buying the bike, we obviously enlarged the photos. I could tell that the bike was a very good bike underneath and that everything was there. So I'm going to wash this off. We're just using this nice big softy brush here. There were a few grease spots here and there on the frame, and we wanted it to be spotless, so it still gets our usual deep clean. And then brand new microfiber towel to dry off the warm soapy water that I've put on there. This always drags off at least 10% of the dirt. And then I'm going to actually polish this bike as well. So I'm using the Autoglim Super Resin Polish. Again, a brand new microfiber towel. We were very, very lucky there with the logo on the headstock of this bike. It actually had the original plastic on it from factory, and although it looked a little bit deteriorated, when we peeled that protection plastic off of the logo, it was like a brand new badge on the front, so we were thrilled about that. There's a little bit of marking on this rear triangle. I had to work that a little bit more to make sure that we could get those little marks off, but fortunately for us they did all come off. And as we're polishing this down now, again with a new microfiber towel, you can begin to see the reflection forming on that paint where it's really come up. And then the final thing for us to do is to spray it with the Autoglim Rapid Ceramic Spray. This will afford a new layer of protection on the bike. This is a process I really stand behind, as that final touch I can go above and beyond with. I've also tested the waterproofing, and the water runs off the bike, which keeps it clean for that little while longer. Which, like I say, I think is a nice touch after getting your bike serviced, that has that durability for a few rides after to enjoy the work that's been done. Now we're going to work on these lovely Mike Burrows wheels. I believe these tyres were probably the original ones with the bike. The Schwalbe logo on that is a very, very old design. But look at those spokes. Look at the centre, the size of those heads on those spokes. These are a well and truly bladed spoke. Very unique to this year, very unique to the Mark 1 Giant TCR. These are the defining feature of this bike that really, really make the design aspects of this bike all come together. I was very, very careful on the stickers that are around the edge of that rim. I don't want to damage those in any way. But you can see here, look at that hub, how little wear that's had. We did take this hub off. We did check the wheel bearings and the hub bearings. They were both absolutely fine. They were sealed bearings and still spun perfectly, so I chose not to fix what isn't broken. On goes that cassette now. I torqued that up as well. I'm also going to line up the logo of the tyre with the valve, and in this instance I'm also replacing both inner tubes on both wheels because the valves are actually different lengths. I would imagine at some point this rear had a puncture and had a valve put in that was a little bit short in comparison with the front, and then that logo wasn't lined up with the valve. But on the front wheel everything was as it should be, but I still replaced the inner tube so that we had fresh inner tubes in this wheels again, so as the bike can be used. There's not going to be any perish rubber in there that's going to fail and give way on the first ride. So once they're in there, I know that I've got fresh rubbers for the inner tubes, and the inner tube valves are the same length front to back, and that the logos on the tyres are all lined up where they need to be, and that these wheels are absolutely spot on when they go back on the bike. Next up, I'm going to fit the handlebars. Again, a very unique design of this Giant was the adjustable stem with the quill and some spacers, which I'll talk about in a future video, but you can see here how much more free flowing these handlebars are. They're absolutely working as they should, so I was quite pleased about that because they were the only bearings potentially that could have caused a problem on the bike, but with the fresh lubrication they went absolutely perfectly. I put some all-purpose grease on the shafts of the bottom bracket. That stops corrosion and means the chain set will easily extract in the future. The grey plastic on that bolt head was once again another win where it was in such great condition. This bike was a really rare find. It defied all the odds to stay this original with no parts cracking or disintegrating to age. And then we're also using a little bit of our anti-seize grease on the threads for the pedals, again to make them easy to change. These are the sort of things that do get changed regularly, especially if the bike goes to a new owner. They may want a different pedal system on there, or even take the pedals off to hang this on a wall. I wouldn't be surprised if this one ends up as a wall art. Next up, we're putting the hanger back on the rear. You can see how clean and lovely that is now looking. On goes the rear derailleur. Just using a little bit of our copper anti-seize grease on the mount for the rear caliper. That now goes on. You can see it's got the brand new pads. Same with the front. Copper grease on the mount to stop that bonding in there in any way. Fresh pads, all the thumb adjusters adjusted and cleaned and everything right. Now I'm going to actually replace the inners of the cables. I wanted to leave the original outers. They were this lovely silver colour with grey ends. Jaguar originals, they would have been original to the bike. I didn't want to disturb or affect those in any way, so I just replaced the inners with our super slick cables. These are stainless steel. They're a very tightly wound cable, which means they would deal with any possible kinks or damage inside those original outers, so they will flow and work absolutely perfectly on this bike once they're in. We do sell those on our website. If you made a purchase on our website, thank you very much, because it enabled us to get hold of this bike and bring it to the channel as a video, so please do check out our website. We recently listed bar tape and tyres on there, so take a look next time you need anything for your bike. We'll always pop the link to our website in the description below, so please do check that out. In goes the cable into that outer. Those new inners slid through the outers without grabbing, and so I know we'll have a great shift moving forwards. But what I do with the rear derailleur and the brakes is I use a little cable guide there that I can cut the cables so that I know that the rear derailleur and the brakes, the tails are all the same length. It's just a quick and easy way of measuring those and making sure they're all the same length. And it's something that I do day to day as well with all my cabling, so that you can almost identify your own cabling through the length of the tail. So there it goes in there, cuts off so they're the same, and a new cable end on there. And now all the cabling has been done on the bike. Now we're going to put these lovely wheels back on. You've seen in previous videos where we use our silver chains, these lovely reflective chains that we use on most restorations. In this instance I put the original chain back on. I found an old chain link there that was a very similar colour to the chain, so that again it didn't catch your eye to the difference in the chain and the link. I actually searched in my drawers for a while to find that, but I felt it was really important to keep it original looking. And now we're putting this lovely new bar tape on. It has the Sinelli logo working its way throughout, and we cut that off, and then we will sort out the end here. And then I'm using a logoed over sticker, effectively like a finishing sticker on the end of this bar tape, which has the Snelly logo. So I lined up the logo with the logo that was printed onto the handlebars to make sure everything was aligned, and then we worked that round, and you can see what a lovely finish that gives as original as was on this bike. A little bit of thumb adjuster work there to make sure it's changing gear. It's operating absolutely perfectly. Check the front derailleur as well. That's operating absolutely perfectly. Very, very pleased with the shifting here. Make sure the brakes are working. They pull really positively with the new cables. They're not pulling the wheel over like they were before, where they're now nice and square on the wheel. Those lovely carbon composite forks are looking superb, and now I can go through the bike and torque everything up. Starting off with the shifters and then the bars here. If they're loose, they could cause an accident with the bars jolting. That's something that's happened to me before, and it's very dangerous. Brakes, obviously we've had those off the bike, so we need to make sure that the pinch bolts and the pads themselves are at the correct torque. We don't want these pads to move when they're being pulled hard, or move in general and then scuff the wheels. Torquing the pedals with the claw fitting, they were slightly wrung off, and I didn't want the Allen tool to slip on these in any way, so I played it very safe and steered clear. The seat post clamp there was very loose. The saddle clamp was a little bit loose, needed a little bit of tightening. And then also we worked our way around the rear brake as we did the front brake to make sure everything there is okay. Then the last torque settings to check are the rear derailleur ones, and that's the transformation complete. This bike was in great condition, but it wouldn't shift, and it had the few gremlins which we've ironed out. Here are the before and afters that I'm very pleased with. What a dream bike to work on. It was a pleasure to do this one. Cleaning it up, servicing it, lubricating everything, making sure everything's working. It wasn't shifting when it came in. It is now, and it is now absolutely perfect. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe. Drop a comment about your first ever road bike, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.